Hi everyone. Today I would like to talk to you about server security. We're going to talk about how we can monitor different pieces of our server, such as apps, ports, traffic settings, or users. We are going to talk a little bit about how we can harden servers, and we're going to talk about some common security concerns and things that we can do about them. So one of the first things that we can talk about is server health tracking. So when we talk about servers, we talk about server health in that we're trying to figure out the condition of our server. Now, when we talk about server health tracking and monitoring, what we're trying to have is both a baseline, what should our server be doing, and also a way of being able to flag things if the server is doing something we shouldn't or don't want it to do. So, for example, one of the things that we can have is an allow list or a deny list. Now, this used to be called whitelisting, blacklisting, but that's really not the case anymore. You may still hear it referred to that way in industry, but people are trying to change it. If you are interested in a little bit of background, I have a link about why it's no longer referred to that way. An allow list and a deny list is one of the ways that we can both keep track of things like the traffic coming in and also have some rules about what would happen. So, for example, we could have an allow list for some websites. We could have a deny list for some websites. If you recall back to when we were talking about firewalls and IP tables, you'll remember that we talked a little bit about allow lists and deny lists there, because we were talking about the traffic coming into the server and what we want to happen with that traffic. Now, whenever we end up doing any server health tracking, one of the things that we'll run into is false positives and false negatives. What that means is if we are keeping track of the server and we know what the server should be doing, we might end up flagging something as a concern. A false positive would mean we've flagged it as a concern, but it's actually not a concern. A false negative would be that we did not flag it as a concern, but we should have. Some things that we're probably going to want to keep track of on our servers is going to be things like the subsystems and kernel modules and what's happening there. What's going on with the memory and processes on the server? Are there any processes that are taking up more memory than we want it to? What's happening with our CPU cycles? Is there anything concerning? Is the CPU working harder than we might expect? How much disk space is being used, what's going on with the network coming into and going out of the server, and is there anything concerning happening with users. So for example, we might see that we might want to have a concern if our memory is spiking at a time when we only have one or two users on there that don't have any jobs that are going to be doing anything very memory intensive. Or we might be concerned if we have, let's say, a 1 terabyte server and it starts filling up in a 7-day period. This isn't necessarily, oh my goodness, we've been hacked. It's just if we have a 1 terabyte server and if it's gone from maybe 2% disk usage to 50% disk usage in a 7-day period, we need to know why and what's going on there. We also want to keep track of things like what is sort of the common use cases of our server, who is using our server, what are their general behaviors. So like for example, on the CIS server from the Intro to Linux course, well, on that server, I know that that's a student focused server, which means on a regular company, sure, people are going to be working 9 to 5, and maybe I would want to flag something if, somebody's working at 11 p.m. at night. Maybe that's really, a concern. Why is someone doing that? But like on a student focused server, I wouldn't want to flag something as 11 p.m. at night. Oh no, there's a concern. Let me shut them down. Because frankly, I was a student for many, many years. 11 p.m. at night is a common time for students to work. So, I don't necessarily want to have a big problem with that. But maybe I do want to start worrying about things like disk usage, because if I know students are going to be creating very, very small text files and all of a sudden my disk space goes from empty to full in a short period of time, I need to know why, because there's probably something going on there that I'm concerned about. Now, there are some common commands that you can use for server monitoring. So one of the things that I would like you to do is go try them. So you can pause me here and run through some of these commands, see what you see, and just sort of get an idea of how to run them, what they look like, what are reasonable responses, and all those kinds of things. Now that we've talked about how we are able to check on our server to make sure that everything is going well, the next thing that we want to talk about is hardening our system. So when we have our servers, we need to think about what's going on with the server and how can we protect that server better. Hardening a system is the process that we take, generally repeatedly, to go through our system and make sure it's as protected as possible. Hardening a system is something that you would do when you first set up a server, but it's actually also a continuous process. Hardening of a system is something that's probably going to be done on a regular basis, because some of these are things that may end up changing depending on the situation or scenario. Some of these are things that might end up changing based on how the server is actually being used in real life. So for example, we can talk about locking down the hardware. So if we're talking about an actual, real life physical, I can walk up to it and kick it type server, well, I'm probably going to want to lock down USB booting, and I'm probably going to want to have a BIOS password, because I really don't want people to have physical access to my server in those ways. I'm also probably going to want to do things like regularly check my file systems for anomalies. I am probably going to want to regularly check my repositories, installed programs, and ports and protocols. So when we have programs that we are installing, one of the things that happens is sometimes we install something because we think it's going to help us perform a function, but it actually doesn't. So when we get rid of that program, we don't necessarily clean up everything that that program has done. So if we have added a repository or a PPA, we need to make sure, do we still need it? Is that something that we are still using? And if it isn't, we need to get rid of it. If we have installed programs and services, every single installed program and service on the server needs to be up to date and patched. The fewer of these you have, the better, because then you have to worry about both less patches and also less ways in. So the more things that you have installed on your server is basically opening up more doorways into your server. So if you can get rid of things that are no longer used, that can be a really nice way of making sure that you're sort of closing up the castle. We're also going to want to do things like regularly check ports and protocols. Is this still reasonable? Do we still need all of these ports open? Did this server originally start as a let's do everything type server and we needed a lot of ports open? Is it still like that? Has it now transformed into maybe SSH only or files only or database only, things like that? We want to think about things like root logins. Do we allow root logins? Do we still need to allow root logins? Can we get rid of root logins? Is the system up to date and patched? When was the last time you checked that? Have more patches come out? And this is actually sort of a corollary to paying attention to the news. One of the things that you may or may not be already doing is paying attention to what's going on in the tech news world. Well, if you're going to be working on a server and doing any admin things, it's actually, along with other jobs, very important to pay attention to what's going on in the tech world, because that way you can hear about things like vulnerabilities that have just been disclosed, bugs that have just come out, so that you can make sure that you are patching your server against those as soon as possible. If you have a system that uses SE Linux, make sure that it's enabled if it's possible to enable it. And then you're also going to want to do things like review your user password rules. User password rules change. Not frequently, but they do change. They do get updated. For a really long time, the common sort of wisdom was you should change your password every 90 days. Well, that's actually not the case anymore. Nobody recommends changing your password every 90 days anymore because what they were finding is people that had to change their passwords that often were using much crummier passwords because they were struggling to remember them. Because most people don't use encrypted password databases. P.S. If you don't, you should. And because of that, they were changing them. So, like, for example, one really common password is seasonal. So, if you have fall 2022, oh no, I need to change it in 90 days. Well, I guess spring 2023. That's a brand new password. And sure, it might meet your password criteria. They've changed it, but I think we can all say that that is not a good password. So you want to think about the password rules and review them, maybe once a year. I would say hardening the system is probably something you're going to want to do. At least give it a quick check down the checklist, probably once a quarter. And password rules, you could give a quick check to when you're doing the hardening, or you could have a yearly reminder to make sure that you're still up to date. Part of hardening your system is also going to be things like log monitoring, auditing, and backups. So you're going to want to keep track of all of the things happening in the system, logging. And then we're going to want to go back and actually be like, hey, logs, what's going on? That's going to be the auditing of our logs. And then we're going to want to back up our system. And we're going to talk a little bit more about backups in a bit. And then, sort of one of the last pieces is seeing if you have rootkits. So, there's a couple of different ways that you can look for that, but you want to check your system pretty regularly for rootkits. Now, when we talk about security on the system, one of the really common concepts is called least privilege. The policy of least privilege is giving everybody the literal least amount of privilege, the least amount of access that they need to do their job. Now, this is where you can end up having some friction because as a server admin, we want to lock down our servers as much as possible so that we don't have as many disasters. Users want as much access to the server as possible so that they can do a lot of things themselves. So it ends up having this like negotiation that you have. What do you need? Who needs it? What type of access do they need? Because you don't want to have just like either you have zero access, you can log onto the server and you can't do anything, or root access, full access, feel free, have fun. We want to have a lot of in between options. And we're probably going to want to have a lot of in between options that's going to be, well, maybe you can make these changes here or those changes there. And you want to have a negotiation with the people that you're working with to make sure that they have enough access to do their jobs, but they don't have more access than they need. How do we want to limit that? You also want to make sure that your security policies in general is going to be educating the people that are going to be doing it. One of the big failings of a lot of security in companies is when the security policies basically come down from on high. And it says something like, well, you have to patch your server every month. It's like, well, okay, cool, but what if I don't have anything to patch? Oh, well, you have to patch it anyway. It's like, well, with what? You know, if we have policies coming in on other pieces or, audits, things like that, it's really important that you are explaining what's going on and why when you need to. So, one of the biggest, I would say, conflicts in security is if you have a security team that is just going to be saying this is what we're doing, but there's no real explanation for it, it's a lot harder to get people on board. And as server admins, we're going to have some of the same issues. If we explain to people, these are our password policies because, and at least give them the references so that those that want the references can, sort of get on board with what we're doing and why. It makes it a lot easier to have those policies so that people will actually say, oh, okay, yeah, no, I see why fall 2022 is a bad password. Let me try to pick something else. So we want to think about how we're doing that, and then we want to think about the implementation. How are we enforcing our policy? So a really simple example of this is user passwords and password policies. It's really common on systems to have a password policy that is a capital letter, a lowercase letter, a number, and a special character. Usually they'll also have a character minimum length, like let's say 8 characters. So the policy is that your password has to meet those requirements. The implementation of that policy is that if your password does not meet those requirements, the system will not allow you to change your password. So it's really important that those policies and the implementation go hand in hand, so that you have a way of being able to say, okay, well, you have to meet this, and this is what will happen. We won't allow you to change your password if it doesn't meet our password policy. So on servers, we have something called IDS and we have something called IPS. IDS is intrusion detection system, and IPS is intrusion protection system. Now, both of these can be on a server, but they have some big differences. While it is true that they are both there to keep track of and help protect our servers, an IDS is specifically used for detection and monitoring. So it's basically keeping track of what's happening on the server based off of rules that you have given it. An IDS isn't going to do anything. It's just going to say, I'm going to keep track of and log these occurrences or those occurrences, or I'm going to match programs against this database that you've given me and log if any are considered concerning. And IPS is going to take that rule set and then actually do something with it. So it's going to say, okay, well, I have seen, so let's take, for example, a program in a database. Now, one of the things that happens in security is we have databases of basically concerning programs. So if you have a program that is known malware, the signature of that program is going to go into a database. An IDS would say, hey, this signature matches my database, and then log it. An IPS would say, hey, this signature matches my database, I'm going to block it. And we can do the same type of thing with, like, for example, packets. This packet is coming in and it's coming in from a known malware source. IDS would just say, okay, I'll log it. IPS would say, okay, I'm going to log it and also block it. Now, IPS ends up needing a whole lot of rules to be able to work correctly. It doesn't end up needing administrator support, so there's not really human interaction required. IDS does. It needs a person. It is able to work with what's going on, but nothing happens without that person interfering and working with it. So they're both useful in different ways. Now, after we've gone through and checked our server and done some hardening and tried to set up all of our protections, the IDS or IPS or both, the next thing that we can do is a vulnerability scan. A vulnerability scan is going to be able to check your server and find your attack surface. It will help you create a prioritized list of vulnerabilities, and it will help you keep things up to date. So a vulnerability scanner actually ends up getting used sort of on both sides of the house. It can be used as a way of setting up protections. If we run a vulnerability scanner, find a vulnerability in the server, we can then patch it immediately. It can also be used on the other side of the house where we can run a vulnerability scan against the server and then find a way into that server. So vulnerability scanners are actually an incredibly valuable tool for a lot of different people. Endpoint protections are also something that you'll see really commonly as set up if you're going to be doing any admin work, because endpoint protection is trying to protect the enterprise data. One of the things that's been happening in a lot of companies is BYOD. bring your own device. And because bring your own device means that we now have a whole bunch of devices that are connecting to pieces of our system, we can't sort of protect against the devices anymore, so we have to think about how we're protecting our data. So endpoint is the literal endpoint of the network, such as things outside of a firewall. Now, you can have a centrally managed server like we have at Neko, or you can have a software as a service type of solution, and you can have protections that way. There's a ton of third parties that will go and do that. But endpoint protections is a way of being able to protect the data from exfiltration, leaving the company. Now, when we talk about the different types of scans, we have vulnerability scanners, which are saying, hey, where are the holes in the wall to our castle, the castle being the server. We can also have other types of scans. We can have real-time scans, what's happening right now. We can have preset time scans, what happens at 1 a.m. We can have signature-based scans. Is this known malware? We can have behavioralistic or heuristic scans. Is this really weird behavior? So do we have somebody logging onto the server and copying a lot of files off of the server? How strange. We can scan traffic, so we can think about the traffic coming into and out of the server. Now, an important note here. Scans can be done in-house, third parties. There's probably lots of scans that happen, vulnerability scanners that happen, places around the company that are doing scans. Uptime is also important. If you spend all of your time scanning, that takes up some traffic. So you need to make sure that you are still meeting your support and uptime requirements of your server. So sure, you can do real-time in-depth scans, but if you have a real-time in-depth scan of every single piece of traffic that's coming into your server, you're going to end up with this huge bottleneck, and bottlenecks do not make for happy users. So you need to be a little bit judicious about when you are doing your scanning and how you are doing your scanning. Now that we've talked about all of these different things with servers, we're going to talk about logging. Because when we have any variety of server security, we have to make sure that we are keeping track of the correct pieces of data, our logs. We need to think about what it is that we want to track. Is it applications, events, services, or systems? How long are we keeping these logs? Are we keeping them a day, a week, a month, a year? How are we reviewing logs? So I know this is only one quick bullet point, but log review, log audits, all of those things, log analysis are so important. It is great if you have logging happening on your server and you have lots of different things being tracked and you're keeping logs of everything. That's lovely. But that only does you good if you actually go do something with the log. It's oh yeah, no, I kept track of every single time the store was burgled, and let me show you the graph of how often the store was burgled. Cool. But you need to make sure that you're actually going back and looking at the logs. What happened? Why did this happen? Is there anything that we want to use to maybe change our models so that we can go back through our logs and say, oh yeah, this store is always getting burgled at 3 a.m. Maybe I should set some extra alarms for 3 a.m. So it's really important that you actually do something with your logs. You can have log analysis scripts. There's a lot of third-party tools. You want to make sure you have backups of all of your logs. And you want to make sure that you're checking that your log hasn't been infiltrated. So one of the things that will happen is if somebody is getting access to your system and you don't want them to, they will sometimes wait, and that waiting will mean that they'll actually get into your backups. It's also really common that you'll see malware or threats go in and actually change the logs to try to erase their tracks. So you want to make sure that you're actually checking your log file for changes and maybe, for example, hash your log files so that you can see if anybody tried to change it. Now, Linux has a whole bunch of specific logs, so you can actually go see your logs may or may not be in this location. They might be somewhere else, but you should have all kinds of logs on your system already set up. You don't have to set up any of these. The system activity logs, authentication logs, failed login logs, log of installs, all of those should already be all set up in your system. So take a minute, go log on to your systems, go find your logs, see what's going on, and see what you see what they look like. The logs are going to be too large for you to really get too much out of them, but you can go in and actually be like, oh, hey, yeah, so this is what failed logins look like. Now that we've talked about all of this, one of the things that's changed in the last, 30 years of server admin work is dashboards. It used to be that we were able to log things, do some log analysis, use some power tools, use some scripts, get some good information. However, systems have gotten so big, logs have gotten so big, that we actually end up wanting to use some probably third-party services to be able to have a dashboard set up for us. So rather than needing to run a shell script to go check our logs, we can actually have a dashboard with a nice little widget that we can program that will alert us when something goes wrong. So this is one of the nice things that have changed in the last 15 years. Dashboards can help us know what's happening in real time. We can get alerts for things we're specifying. We can visualize the data so that we can share it with others more easily. We can also collect multiple forms of data. So we can look at our logs, but we can also look at our files, our directories. We can capture, PCAP files. We can use this for business analytics. When are our most popular times? When are our least popular times? We can use this for troubleshooting. If we have a dashboard set up, we can end up seeing where the bottlenecks are, where the issues are. We can get, basically real-time, immediate feedback if, for example, one of our servers goes down. It can give us a really nice way of being able to picture the overall view of our server. Now, if you are a NECC student, but only if you are an NECC student, you can go do the Splunk activity. This is in Blackboard, and you can sign up for this. A NECC student has access with your EDU address. If you are not a student at NECC and listening to my video, I guess come take a class with me, and then you can also do the Splunk activity. And then we're going to talk about reviews and checklists. So when we talk about security, one of the things that has happened a lot in security is we've moved towards checklists. A checklist is exactly what it sounds like. We have a whole bunch of things that we have to do. We have checkboxes, and as we do them, we check them off. Now, checkboxes are actually something that has gone across multiple industries. You'll see them a lot in healthcare as well. We can automate some of them sometimes. We need to think about what's on the checkbox, what's on the checklist, what needs to be done. But one of the things that's really awesome about checklists, we can make sure that the exact same thing happens in the exact same order, no matter who is working on the system. So if we have 50 servers that all need the same checkups, we can use a checklist to be able to go through and make sure that all of our servers are checked in the exact same way, in the exact same format. We can share it with 10 people so that everybody's only doing some of the servers. And if we're all using the checklist, it's really easy to make sure that we are all checking the exact same things. We're not just saying, hey, go check the server. Let me know how it's doing. You can say, okay, go run the checklist and then give me the results. It also makes it a lot easier to hand it off to other people. So like, for example, if I was a senior server admin, I would be able to hand the checklist to, let's say, 5 junior server admins, and I would be able to say, hey, go check all of our servers and our production and our testing and let me know what you find. And so instead of me having to do that, I can go have other people do that. So that's one of the things that's really nice about having checklists is you can say, okay, well, this is what I want done. And then you can make it so that you don't necessarily have to do it all. And then the last bit is best practices. So I've linked to a couple of NIST. That's the National Institute for Science and Technology. They do a lot of best practices stuff, and they have a lot of repositories, and that's sort of where a lot of people get together to agree on what's happening. And so I have a couple of links here for security in general and a repository of different checklists. So you can see some examples of what checklists would look like in the real world. So that was a surprisingly long video on security and server security. We talked about what we want to monitor, how we can identify and do some different tools for different types of scanning. We talked about some of the common security concerns that we might have. And I hope you are all having a lovely day, and I hope to see you again later.